Two of Canada's biggest national newspaper companies are in talks to merge. The owners of the Toronto Star and the National Post say it's a bid to help respond to the existential threat facing the media industry. The Prime Minister was asked today whether his government would step in to block this deal.
I won't comment on it right now, but I will say we need to continue to make sure we are supporting the ability of Canadians to get local news, to get quality journalism, to keep them informed about how our country is doing and where we're going altogether.
The merger talks come just days after the government's Online News Act was sent for royal assent. And my next guest is an expert in the Canadian media landscape and is here to help make sense of what this all means. Dwayne Winseck is a professor at Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication. Professor, thanks for coming in.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
This is a merger that is a bolt out of the blue. What are the implications of Nordstar and the National Post maybe coming together here?
Yeah. Well, I think the immediate implication is putting two of the largest newspaper publishers in the country under one ownership roof. And usually the second shoe to fall after consolidation like this is deeper and more extensive cuts, a consolidation of backroom operations, news bureaus pared back even further than they've already been, and a justification that this is going to be good for Canadians and we should be okay with it.
It seems like an unlikely marriage to me. I mean, editorially, if you look at them, the National Post and its leanings versus the Toronto Star and its leanings as a family of companies. I mean, how does this merger make sense?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if it does make sense. We've seen Postmedia go on an acquisition spree for the last decade, 2015, taking over the Sun newspaper chain, the newspaper swap that it did with Nordstar, 2017, Brunswick News in 2022, and none of these have really panned out. Now, whether or not this one is going to be any different, I'm rather doubtful, and I think bringing these two together is a little bit like oil and water.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about that merger. We do know the outcomes of it when essentially the Postmedia and the Sun all came together. There are promises here in Ottawa, for example, the Citizen and the Sun would remain distinct operations, but eventually the newsrooms and the editorial structures merged. The buildings have been sold off. I mean, how have those mergers played out in your mind in the past?
Yeah, well, I think there's two really important points to make here. One is it involved even more asset stripping and job cuts, news bureau shuttering, real estate sold off. That's one thing. The second thing is I think they made a bit of a fool out of the Competition Bureau under its old regime at that point in time when they made that pledge about keeping separate newsrooms as if they would be able to maintain separate editorial policies under one ownership structure. And as you just noted, that didn't come to pass. Meanwhile, the Competition Bureau had promised to basically oversee this. But what we know is that once a merger goes through, the ability of competition regulators to do anything afterwards is really negligible. And that's what happened there. So the Competition Bureau came out looking rather foolish.
What does this say about the state of Canadian media here? I mean, Unifor has already come out against this. The government's obviously going to be asked to take a look at this. I mean, what do you think the government should do? And what does this tell us of where newspapers are in Canada in 2023?
Yeah. Well, the way I like to think about this is this has been a problem that's been a long time in the making. Really, if you want to take a historical perspective, it's 2 decades in the making. And I think the taproot of many of the problems that we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years stem back from an excess of consolidation in the 2000s that saddled these companies with extraordinary debt and left them very ill positioned to take on the new realities brought about by a more internet-centric media universe. So while that was taking shape and while Google and Meta were consolidating their grip on the digital advertising space, these companies had basically saddled themselves with all sorts of debt and were ill-equipped to deal with that. And, you know, here we are now, and they like to do a lot of hand-waving that points to contemporary realities to exculpate themselves from what they had done in the past 2 decades and to blame it all on Facebook and Google. Yeah. Those sound bites may sound great. I don't think they get at the reality.
Yeah, Postmedia in particular, bought by a U.S.-based hedge fund, and that's been a challenge. Just the debt servicing for the leveraged acquisition of it has been a problem. So you mentioned Facebook and Google. The big debate in this town when it comes to media is C-18. Meta was here yesterday saying they're going to permanently ban Canadian news. Google still seems to be talking to the government to find a path forward. How do you think all of that plays into this merger backdrop and the disruptive period we're in Canadian media?
Yeah. So to my mind, C-18 in principle could have been a good thing if it had dealt very squarely with the problem of market dominance, market consolidation over the online advertising space, the kind of surveillance capitalism model, hoovering up all of people's data and to build this business model. But instead of really addressing those core problems, what it did is it became a kind of a wish list for the newspaper and news media lobbying groups. And the government bought that hook, line, and sinker. And I think they robbed themselves of the legitimacy of a policy framework. Now they have this policy or regulatory framework that really was, kind of made on demand of the domestic news media entities, whether it is Nordstar or Postmedia or Bell Media. And those companies, I think, have basically played the government for fools. They got the regulatory agenda they wanted. They held off these brutal cuts until after the ink was, about to set on those bills, and now the government has a huge mess to clean up. It's got a bad act, and it's got bad news media actors in this country who have played it. And the position of the government here does not look very good. Maybe we can have a reset at the Competition Bureau, and it can do something more significant. And maybe the implementation of the Online News Act will end up being better than what the bill has turned out to be.
Okay. Dwayne Winseck of Carleton University, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, David.